Hey everyone, I hope everyone's doing well this weekend. Did you know that the mob is alive and growing in Cleveland, Ohio, with over 1,000 members? And this is in 2025. So, what the hell am I talking about? Well, believe it or not, there is a mob that's in Cleveland, Ohio that does have 1,000 members, but it's not it's not a Italian mafia gang. It's actually an African American gang where they follow Cosa Nostra. They follow the rules, and it's really interesting how they've structured their organization in some ways like Cosa Nostra. So we're going to talk about that today. Please hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. And without further delay, on to our feature presentation. So this week I was in Reddit in the Mafia subreddit, and I came across an interesting article that the author posted, and it was about a Cleveland-based mob. And so, who is this Cleveland mob? Well, it's actually an African American based gang that decided to adopt a structure of Cosa Nostra so that they use the rules loosely of Cosa Nostra to run the gang. And so it first started off as the Heartless Felons, and they emerged in the early 2000s in Ohio juvenile correctional facilities. It's mostly youth between the ages of 15 and 19. And a guy named Lapone is the one that founded the Heartless Felons. And so all these guys were from Cleveland. They would use codes like 216, which is Cleveland's area code, to mean born a felon among members. And so it started off, like I said, as a gang in prison, but then it grew into Ohio's largest and fastest growing gang on the street. And like I says, mostly young black men. And by the 2010s, the Heartless Felons members who had gotten released from custody were creating a lot of crimes on the streets. In fact, in 2015, a Heartless Felon known as Duke, who was later identified as Douglas Shine Jr., committed the Warrensville Heights barbershop massacre. And this was a gang beef between the Heartless Felons and another gang called the Loyal Always. And in this massacre, you had three people that got killed in the barbershop. And so this crime continued throughout the 2010s, a lot of violence, and it became something that the community was well aware of. So the Heartless Felons had a lot of subgroups, and in 2012, you had a gang known as the Fully Blooded Felons, and this group is the one that became organized and Cosa Nostra inspired. And so this is the faction, we're going to talk about today. And in the early 2010s, these fully blooded felons were active on Cleveland's east side and beyond. And so they were mostly involved in street level brutality. They had a lot of discipline that was honed from the time in prison. And they said, according to federal indictments, uh, they had initially started in Cleveland, but they had extended into cities like Akron and Youngstown. And what was interesting about them is that law enforcement stated that the FBF styled themselves after a mafia crime family, even referring to their leader as the Godfather. And they enforced an oath of loyalty and silence reminiscent of Cosa Nostra. So we're talking about Omerta. So the hierarchy of the fully blooded felons was deliberately modeled on Italian mafia lines. At the top was Raven Mullins. So he's the founder and the acknowledged godfather of the gang. And he also had a structure beneath him. He had ranks like commissioners and capos. And so, much like a mafia don, Mullins would convene a commission, which was more or less a leadership council. And these were trusted lieutenants that had the title of commissioners who helped to govern the enterprise, and they helped make decisions on what criminal ventures to pursue. Below them were capos, which again is a term lifted from Cosa Nostra, and this was the crew leaders that would manage the day-to-day operations. And then you had the soldiers beneath them. So again, you had this pyramid that resembled a classic mafia family. You had Mullins as the boss, a board of high-ranking advisors, which were commissioners, which is analogous to underbosses or a concierge. You had capos leading the crews, and then the rank and file soldiers. So, by all accounts, this level of organizational sophistication was unprecedented for a street gang in Cleveland. And the FBI in Cleveland actually went so far as to call FBF Cleveland's most significant gang threat. So, basically, they were dangerous because of the discipline and the hierarchy and the mafia like control over territory and the schemes they were involved in. And just like Omerta, they had strict initiation rules. So the fully blooded felons enforced their own creed and rituals to make sure the soldiers were loyal. And prospective members of the Heartless Felons, and by extension, the FBF, had to prove themselves. And they did this by completing at least three violent or criminal missions before they'd be fully accepted. And these missions, they could be anything from robberies and assaults to actually murders. And if they were in prison, sometimes the designated targets could be other inmates or even prison guards. And you had to do what was told, or you'd get a beating or killed. And so only after completing the required three missions would an initiate earn the status as a felon. So being known as a felon was the same as a made man in the mafia. The induction was marked by a pledge. You had to memorize codes, and one known pledge was to have the heart of 1,000 men. And so this reflected the gang's ideal of fearless, remorseless resolve. New members had to learn the 10 golden rules of the Heartless Felons, and it included edicts like never stealing from a comrade. You couldn't show weakness. You couldn't engage in homo activity. And to guide this behavior, they had a lot of discipline. Um, and if you broke the rules, you got punished. And so within the FBF subset, Raven Mullins instituted a further rule set called the Fully Five. And these were five core rules every FBF member was required to memorize and recite at meetings. And he would actually have pop quizzes where he would say, "Hey, what are these rules?" And you'd be threatened with punishment if you didn't know. And so, according to prosecutors, the Fully Five include commands to follow all orders from the commission, pledge loyalty to fellow members, and show respect to the capos in charge. And in addition, FBF members had to abide by a longer set of principles, which was referred to as the Fully Commandments. And so it was similar to the Fully Five, but it was kind of more of an expanded gang rule book. A lot of the rules involved were that you didn't snitch. Snitching on someone was an unforgivable sin, and it was punishable by death. Any cooperating witness faced death sentences from the gang. Everything about Omerta was what this organization was about. So the code of silence led this gang, this African American gang. So the main leader of the fully blooded felons is Raven Mullins, and he's 35 years old. And then his lieutenant, or I would say like his underboss, is a guy named Henry Burgess. He was known as Noodles, and he's 29 years old. So you had a lot of other commissioners and capos. Some of the most well known in Cleveland was a guy named James Clemens. He was known as Fully Pope Flock. You also had guys like Demarcus Elliott and Dantes Hammond, and even Jerry Mullins, who's a relative of the leader, uh, Raven Mullins. For the most part, these were African American males, but unlike traditional mafia families, women could be involved in subordinate roles. Mostly, the women would be involved in carrying out kidnappings and assaults on the gang's orders. And so, while the women weren't formally made members, they were used as trusted associates. So, how did the FBF actually make money? And like a lot of gangs, they were involved in street level activities like drug trafficking. I would say that's probably their biggest money maker. They ran an open air drug market in Cleveland's Cedar Estates neighborhood, and they dominated the narcotics trade there for nearly a decade. They said under Mullins' direction, they distributed a lot of drugs, including fentanyl, methamphetamines, cocaine, and even opioid substitutes, which were often smuggled into jails. They said the enterprise was so organized that they maintained stash houses and apartment units to stockpile the drugs and firearms. They said a raid on two such units during the investigation yielded over 400 grams of fentanyl, along with cocaine, meth, and 15 illegal guns. And besides what was going on the street, they were actively infiltrating the Ohio prison system, not just to recruit inmates, but to turn prisons into secondary drug markets. And according to the U.S. Attorney, Mullins and associates applied to have people actively infiltrate the Ohio prison system to distribute drugs there so gang members could reap the profits. And so that was going on underneath the eyes of, the prison guards. Again, violence was a constant tool and outcome of all the operations of FBF. And it was a years long pattern of racketeering and violence. So they commit murders, attempted murders, kidnappings, robberies, arsons, and assaults. One of the most chilling examples was the September 2023 murder of Cleveland's West Side, where Mullins, Burchick, and others allegedly shot a victim to death, then burned his car used in the drive by, and this was used to intimidate rivals and destroy evidence simultaneously. They said in another instance, three FBF women, nicknamed Ali, Action, and Yayo, were charged with luring and kidnapping a victim for violent punishment in aid of racketeering. And they said beyond the target hits, FBF members engaged in brazen gunplay on the streets. They said police reports from the 2010s detailed drive-by shootings and gun battles linked to the Heartless Felons turf disputes. Besides that, there was a lot of organized theft and robbery rings. A group of individuals tied to the Heartless Felons conducted a multi-state robbery spree where they would break into electronic stores across 9 states and fence over $500,000 in stolen goods back in Cleveland. So these interstate operations showed a level of coordination and ambition characteristic of any other organized criminal network. So by the early 2020s, law enforcement was well aware of what these guys were doing on the street and in prison, and so there's a lot of major crackdowns. There was one high-tech smuggling case, for example, where 4 heartless felons were indicted in 2022 for using drones to smuggle drugs and contraband into Ohio prisons, and they even attempted to fly in a firearm. So the FBF got hit hard by 2023. Like I said, they were high profile cases. The feds and state was looking to arrest and take off the street the leaders of the FBF, and they were successful. By December 2024, 18 members and associates of the FBF were arrested under a racketeering case. These charges included murder in aid of racketeering, drug conspiracy, weapons offenses, kidnapping, and assaults. Principal among the accused was Raven Mullins and Henry Burchett, the godfather himself and the underboss of this organization. So by 2025, there's not much left of the FBF as all of the leaders are now um, awaiting trial. And what you have left on the street are lower level guys, and in the organization is not as stable as it once was. That doesn't mean the danger's over. It just means that they were hit pretty hard by the arrest in 2024. But one thing I want to mention is despite styling themselves after the Italian American Mafia, the fully blooded felons had no known formal alliance or direct conflict with the traditional Cleveland mob. By the time the FBF rose to power in the 2010s, the Cleveland's old mafia family, which was the Lecavoli crime family, had been largely decimated by the FBI crackdowns. And so what remained of the mafia, talking about Cosa Nostra in Cleveland, was quiet, and they were involved in rackets far removed from the street drug trade. And so the relationship between FBF and the mob was more inspirational than operational. These guys, the FBF, would borrow the mob's jargon and methods, but they didn't report to any mafia bosses. I think what we could say that happened is that with the demise of the actual Cleveland mob, the fully blooded felons was able to fill a power vacuum that was left by traditional organized crime, being gone off the streets. So So even though the fully blooded felons operated in a mode similar to Cosa Nostra, they had no relation, no ties, no relationships with the mob. Okay, everyone, that was all I wanted to talk about today. To me, the fully blooded felons, subset of the heartless felons, is interesting. I mean, you get a group, that a gang that wants to model themselves after Cosa Nostra, and they were actually pretty successful for over a decade. But like I said, in today's world, with cameras everywhere, law enforcement being hyper vigilant, it's just harder than ever to be able to succeed, with this type of street level activity that they were involved in, specifically. The drugs and the guns and all that. So it was just a matter of time before the FBF would get picked up. And anyway, what do you think of this? What does this mean for, the legacy of Cosa Nostra, where African American gangs want to model themselves after the mafia? Do you think it was more of what they saw on television? I mean, I have to think that most of these, gang members, saw The Godfather, saw, Donnie Brasco, saw Goodfellas, and they wanted to model themselves after that because it was an organization that was stable, number one. Two, it's discipline, right? You can't really get a group of criminals to coordinate together unless you have strict discipline and have rules. And inevitably you have to have consequences for breaking the rules. So it's just interesting to me. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.